The legend of the North American P-51 Mustang stands as one of aviation history's most enduring myths. With nearly 5,000 confirmed aerial victories across Europe, a maximum range exceeding 1,600 kilometers with drop tanks, and a blistering top speed of 440 miles per hour or 708 kilometers per hour, the Mustang has captured imaginations for 8 decades. Beneath this gleaming reputation lies a darker truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about this legendary fighter. The P-51 Mustang, despite its impressive war record, was fundamentally flawed as a dogfighter, struggling in the very aerial combat scenarios that defined fighter supremacy in World War II. To understand this contradiction, we must first examine what made a superior dogfighter in the brutal skies of 1943 and 1944. The science of aerial combat demanded 3 critical performance metrics: turning ability, climb rate, and control authority at various speeds. When measured against these standards, the Mustang's limitations become starkly apparent. In sustained turning combat, the P-51D model required 20 to 21 seconds to complete a full 360-degree turn at 270 miles per hour or 435 kilometers per hour. This performance paled in comparison to the Supermarine Spitfire Mark 9, which could execute the same maneuver in just 17 to 18 seconds, or the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, which could complete tight turns in an astonishing 15 seconds or less. The disparity became even more pronounced when examining climb rates, a crucial factor in gaining tactical advantage during combat. The P-51D climbed at 3,200 feet per minute or 975 meters per minute, a respectable figure that nonetheless fell short of its primary adversaries. The Messerschmitt Bf 109K4 variant could achieve 4,500 feet per minute, 1,372 meters per minute, while the later Spitfire Mark 14 reached an impressive 4,600 feet per minute, or 1,402 meters per minute. These numbers weren't merely academic statistics, but translated directly into life and death advantages in combat, determining who could reach optimal firing position first, or escape from a disadvantageous engagement. Perhaps most critically, the Mustang suffered from heavy control responses at lower speeds, making tight maneuvering during sustained combat far more hazardous than in competing aircraft. Pilots consistently reported that the aircraft became increasingly difficult to handle as airspeed decreased, particularly during the extended turning engagements that characterized European air combat. This limitation forced Mustang pilots to adopt entirely different tactical approaches, avoiding the sustained horizontal turning fights that other aircraft could execute with relative ease. The voices of the men who flew these machines into combat provide the most compelling evidence of the Mustang's dogfighting limitations. James Alexander Goodson, credited with 15 aerial victories, served as commanding officer of the 336 Fighter Squadron of the 4th Fighter Group. His combat experience spanned multiple aircraft types, from Royal Air Force Hurricanes and Spitfires to the American P-47 Thunderbolt before transitioning to the Mustang. Goodson's assessment was brutally honest. Despite the P-51's impressive overall capabilities, it could not match the turning performance of dedicated air superiority fighters like the Spitfire in sustained combat. His squadron, which achieved 360 enemy aircraft destroyed by war's end, understood intimately the tactical limitations imposed by their aircraft's design characteristics. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a triple ace with 16 1/4 confirmed victories flying with the 357th Fighter Group, provided equally candid observations about the Mustang's combat characteristics. Anderson's aircraft, famously named Old Crow after his preferred whiskey brand, became iconic throughout the European theater. Yet Anderson consistently emphasized that successful Mustang tactics required avoiding sustained turning engagements whenever possible. His combat philosophy centered on energy management and situational awareness, rather than the classical turning dogfights that had dominated fighter combat doctrine since World War I. Anderson's experience demonstrated that the Mustang's survival depended on pilots who understood and worked within the aircraft's limitations, rather than fighting against them. John C. Meyer, with 24 5/10 confirmed aerial victories, became one of the war's most successful Mustang pilots while serving with the 352nd Fighter Group. Meyer's tactical insights proved invaluable in understanding how skilled pilots overcame the Mustang's dogfighting deficiencies. His famous maxim, "Always be looking around, always be watching your back," reflected the reality that Mustang pilots could not rely on superior maneuverability to escape unfavorable combat situations. Instead, They needed exceptional situational awareness and the wisdom to avoid engagements where their aircraft's limitations would prove fatal. The technical explanation for these performance limitations lies in one of the Mustang's most celebrated innovations, the Laminar flow wing design. This revolutionary technology promised unprecedented efficiency and range, achievements that would prove crucial to the aircraft's ultimate strategic value. However, the Laminar flow wing created a fundamental paradox that would haunt the Mustang throughout its combat career. While delivering exceptional fuel efficiency that enabled unprecedented range capabilities, this same wing design suffered from rapid performance degradation at high angles of attack, causing abrupt and dangerous stalls during sustained turning combat. The Laminar flow concept attempted to maintain smooth airflow over a greater portion of the wing surface, reducing drag and improving fuel efficiency dramatically. North American Aviation's designers achieved this through precise wing shaping that positioned maximum thickness near the wing's midpoint, rather than the traditional forward location. This configuration delayed the transition from laminar to turbulent airflow, theoretically reducing drag by up to 34% under ideal conditions. However, this efficiency came at a terrible cost in combat maneuverability. German fighter pilots quickly learned to exploit this critical weakness by forcing Mustangs into sustained horizontal turning engagements, where the laminar flow wing's limitations became apparent. As angle of attack increased during tight turns, the carefully maintained laminar airflow would break down suddenly and catastrophically, causing the aircraft to stall without the gradual warning characteristics that allowed other fighters to operate safely near their performance limits. This phenomenon created what pilots described as a falling off the edge sensation, where the aircraft would abruptly lose lift and control authority with little advance warning. The wing's sensitivity to surface imperfections further compromised its combat effectiveness. Unlike conventional wing designs that could tolerate battle damage, accumulated dirt, or manufacturing variations, the laminar flow wing required near-perfect surface smoothness to function as designed. Combat conditions guaranteed that this perfection could never be maintained, meaning that much of the wing's theoretical advantage disappeared in operational service. Gun ports, propeller wash, and even accumulated insects could trigger early transition to turbulent flow, negating the design's benefits while retaining all of its handling limitations. Yet even as these technical realities painted a grim picture of the Mustang's dogfighting capabilities, events in the war's broader strategic context were creating conditions where conventional measures of fighter performance would prove inadequate to determine ultimate success or failure. By late 1943, the Allied strategic bombing campaign faced a crisis that threatened to derail the entire effort to defeat Germany through air power. The statistics were staggering and unsustainable. Bomber formations penetrating deep into German airspace without fighter escort were suffering casualty rates approaching 30% on individual missions. The scale of these losses becomes clear when examining specific operations that preceded the Mustang's widespread deployment. The first Schweinfurt raid on August 17, 1943, cost 60 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, with another 87 so heavily damaged they had to be scrapped. The second Schweinfurt mission on October 14, 1943, forever remembered as Black Thursday, saw 60 bombers shot down and 17 more damaged beyond repair. Of the 2,900 aircrew members who participated in this single mission, 650 were lost, representing a 22% casualty rate that no military force could sustain indefinitely. These devastating losses occurred because existing Allied fighters lacked the range necessary to escort bombers throughout their missions over Germany. The Lockheed P-38, Lightning and Republic P-47, Thunderbolt, despite their considerable capabilities, could only accompany bomber formations to the German border before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. This left the heavy bombers to face hundreds of German interceptors during the most dangerous portions of their missions, when approaching and departing from heavily defended targets deep in enemy territory. The psychological impact on bomber crews was equally devastating. Aircrew members calculated that statistically, they would not survive their required 25 mission combat tours. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. If each mission carried a 10% loss rate, fewer than 8% of aircrews would complete their tours alive. This grim arithmetic was driving experienced crews to psychological breakdown, while making recruitment of replacement crews increasingly difficult as word of the losses spread throughout training commands. Into this desperate situation came the P-51 Mustang, an aircraft whose primary virtue had nothing to do with dogfighting excellence, but everything to do with solving the range crisis that was destroying the strategic bombing campaign. The Mustang's revolutionary design incorporated internal fuel capacity and efficiency that no other fighter could match. With standard internal fuel, the P-51 could operate at combat distances that exceeded the capabilities of any contemporary single-engine fighter. When equipped with external drop tanks carrying an additional 110 gallons or 416 liters of fuel, the Mustang achieved an operational radius exceeding 800 miles, or 1,287 kilometers. This range capability transformed the strategic situation almost overnight. For the first time since the bombing campaign began, Allied fighter escorts could accompany bomber formations throughout their entire missions, from takeoff in England to targets deep in Germany and back to base. The psychological effect on both Allied and German aircrew was immediate and dramatic. Bomber crews finally had protection during the most vulnerable phases of their missions, while German fighter pilots faced the prospect of engaging well-trained, experienced Allied pilots throughout operations that had previously offered extended periods of uncontested attacks on undefended bombers. The Mustang's combat debut during Operation Argument, the massive bombing campaign later known as Big Week, demonstrated how range could prove more valuable than raw dogfighting performance in determining strategic outcomes. During the week of February 20th through 25th, 1944, Allied air forces conducted coordinated attacks on German aircraft production facilities, flying nearly 6,000 sorties while protected by long-range fighter escorts for the first time. The results were immediately apparent. While Allied losses remained significant at 357 bombers and 28 escort fighters, German losses were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters and 250 airmen killed or wounded during Big Week, including 100 irreplaceable experienced pilots. More critically, the sustained combat revealed that German pilots could no longer operate with impunity during any phase of Allied bombing missions. Previously, German fighters had been able to attack bomber formations, land for refueling and rearming, then launch repeated attacks as the same formations approached and departed from targets. The presence of long-range escorts eliminated this tactical advantage, forcing German pilots into sustained combat with skilled Allied fighters throughout operations. The strategic impact extended far beyond individual combat encounters. German fighter pilot losses were exceeding replacement rates by factors that made long-term resistance impossible. Training time for replacement pilots had been compressed from months to weeks as German aviation fuel shortages intensified. These hastily trained pilots faced combat against experienced Allied pilots flying superior equipment with overwhelming numerical advantages. The monthly attrition rates climbing toward 25% meant that the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot cadre was being systematically eliminated faster than any training program could replace them. As 1944 progressed, the P-51's strategic advantages became increasingly apparent despite its dogfighting limitations. On April 15, 1944, Zeit Fighter Command began Operation Jackpot, systematic attacks on Luftwaffe fighter airfields. The extended range that allowed Mustangs to escort bombers to any target in Germany also enabled them to conduct offensive operations throughout German-controlled territory. Fighter sweeps ahead of bomber formations began clearing German aircraft from the skies before bombers even approached their targets. When German resistance at airfields diminished to levels where attacks were no longer worthwhile, the mission expanded on May 21st to include railways, locomotives, and rolling stock in operations dubbed Chattanooga. The P-51 proved exceptionally capable in this ground attack role, although losses were significantly higher than in air-to-air combat. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine, with its complex cooling system of radiators and tubing, proved far more vulnerable to ground fire than the air-cooled radial engines of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Nevertheless, the psychological impact of these attacks proved devastating to German morale and logistics. German transportation networks, already strained by the demands of multi-front warfare, could not withstand systematic attack by hundreds of Allied fighters operating throughout their territory. Locomotive crews abandoned their trains when Allied fighters appeared, bringing rail transport to virtual standstill in many regions. The cumulative effect disrupted the movement of supplies, reinforcements, and raw materials essential to Germany's war effort. Perhaps more importantly, these attacks demonstrated to German civilians that their air force could no longer protect them, even in areas far from the front lines. The June 6, 1944, D-Day landings occurred under conditions of complete Allied air supremacy, a situation made possible primarily by the long-range fighter operations that had systematically destroyed German air capability. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe managed only 26 sorties against the massive Allied invasion force, a number so small as to be tactically insignificant. This absence of air opposition allowed Allied ground forces to establish their beachheads with minimal interference from German air attack, contributing immeasurably to the operation's success. Statistical analysis reveals the true measure of the Mustang's strategic impact despite its dogfighting limitations. The 357th Fighter Group, equipped entirely with P-51 aircraft, achieved the remarkable feat of claiming 56 5/10 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission on January 14, 1945. This represented the largest single-day aerial victory total achieved by any 8th Air Force group during the entire war. The encounter occurred when 200 Luftwaffe fighters attempted to intercept a bomber formation, resulting in a massive air battle that demonstrated both the scale of German desperation and the effectiveness of well-trained Allied pilots flying long-range fighters. And now, by early 1945, the monthly statistics told a story of complete German Air Force collapse. Luftwaffe losses were running between 1,500 and 2,000 aircraft per month, rates that exceeded German production capacity even at its peak. USAAF Mustang groups were achieving kill ratios between 10-1 and 15-1 against German opposition, numbers that reflected both superior Allied pilot training and the overwhelming advantages provided by long-range capability. Single large-scale raids escorted by 500 or more Mustangs created defensive screens that German fighters could not penetrate effectively. The sheer number of Allied fighters meant that German pilots faced multiple opponents regardless of their tactical approach, while fuel limitations prevented extended combat that might allow superior German aircraft performance to influence outcomes. Ground attack missions were destroying more German aircraft on their airfields in single days than German factories could produce in weeks, creating a hopeless situation for Luftwaffe planners. The contrast with earlier periods reveals the transformation wrought by long-range fighter capability. During October 1943, before widespread P-51 deployment, 8th Air Force bomber sorties credited with attacking their targets suffered loss rates exceeding 9%, with an additional 45% returning with battle damage. By February 1944, with Mustang escorts providing comprehensive protection, these figures had dropped to 3 5/10% losses and 29 9/10% damaged. The improvement directly translated into sustainable operations that could continue indefinitely, rather than the unsustainable attrition that had characterized earlier periods. The final months of the European War witnessed the complete breakdown of organized German air resistance. Allied fighter-bomber operations ranged throughout German territory without meaningful opposition, attacking targets that included everything from individual vehicles to major industrial facilities. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect its own territory became so complete that German ground forces operated without any expectation of air support, a situation unprecedented in modern warfare. I'd say perhaps the most telling statistic lies in pilot survival rates. German fighter pilot losses in March 1944 alone reached nearly 22% of pilots present at the beginning of the month. These astronomical casualty rates meant that even experienced German pilots had little expectation of surviving more than a few months of combat operations. Training programs could not produce replacement pilots fast enough to maintain unit strength, while fuel shortages meant that even available pilots often could not fly combat missions. The P-51 Mustang had succeeded not by becoming the ultimate dogfighter, but by rendering dogfighting itself irrelevant to strategic victory. Its revolutionary range capability allowed it to hunt German fighters throughout their operational territory, denying them the sanctuary of distance that had previously protected them during portions of Allied bombing missions. Rather than engaging in fair fights where superior German aircraft or pilot skill might prevail, Mustang pilots could choose when and where to fight, invariably selecting circumstances that maximize their advantages while minimizing German strengths. The aircraft that couldn't turn with a Spitfire or climb with a Messerschmitt had nonetheless broken the back of the Luftwaffe by making it impossible for German fighters to operate effectively anywhere within their own territory. It had transformed the strategic bombing campaign from a costly failure into the decisive factor that crushed German industrial capacity and morale. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that in modern warfare, tactical superiority meant nothing without the strategic capability to bring that superiority to bear where and when it mattered most. By May 1945, the P-51 Mustang had written itself into history not as the fighter that could out-dogfight its opponents, but as the weapon that could hunt the hunters all the way back to their nest and burn it to the ground. In doing so, it had helped win a war through strategic innovation rather than tactical perfection, proving that sometimes the most important victory comes not from being the best fighter, but from being the right fighter for the mission that truly matters.